Paldies. Sveiki. Laipni lūdzam. If you can't read what's in the top right-hand corner of the board, don't worry. That's the inbox. That's just for me. Some little reminders. In case I get distracted or I forget something, I can always look at the inbox, and at least I can remember what I should be doing. And that's the first part of what I want to talk about. Where I'd like to start is with an idea that, like many of the ideas that I use, I didn't invent it, but I built a little bit upon it. And so I really would like to acknowledge, as I go along, some of the people who've contributed these ideas to me. So this is something that I learned from the nice folks at Object Mentor, who used to talk about 2 values of software. And I thought, I can recognize at least a third one. So that's where I would like to start today, is with 3 values of software. I would like to be very clear about one important thing. These are not the 3 values of software. They are simply 3 values of software out of the 7 or 8 million that you might choose to think about. Now, the first value of software, I think, well, let's even back up. One of the reasons to think about this at all is because of the constant struggle to understand what we mean by the nebulous term business value. You could be in a lot of meetings and have a lot of discussions and maybe some arguments about what business value means. And so I'd like to mention at least, well, exactly 3 kinds of business value in software. The first one I think won't be much of a surprise. The first kind of value in software comes from the features themselves. This is the part that I think when someone uses the term business value, this is almost always what they mean. The most obvious form of business value in software is the features themselves. In fact, it's reached the point where when we use the term features, we are almost certainly using the word features to emphasize that the features generate some kind of value, as opposed to just behavior or stuff the system does. Which reminds me, see, this is why I do it. So I think it's fairly uncontroversial. There's not much argument about the fact that features provide a primary source of business value in software. But we have more than that. A second value in software comes from design. Venkat already spoke about this, Sandra already spoke about this, so I don't necessarily have to speak about it at extreme length. But the second value of software that I tend to focus on, the one where I am probably the most interested these days, the one that certainly I've been teaching about the most over the last 15 years, I shouldn't be old enough to say over the last 15 years, but over the last 15 years is the design. And I want to focus a little bit of energy on this. But before I go there, since I don't want you to sit there going, well, wait, what is the third value that he's going to talk about? I'll just let you know what that is right now. That's feedback. I'll come back to that in a moment. And I find something kind of interesting about these 3 terms. I actually just noticed this the other day as I was thinking about getting ready for this talk, that there's a little bit of a feeling of features and then design and then feedback. I'm not exactly sure if that's true, and I'm not necessarily trying to turn this into a calculus symposium, but I just thought that was kind of interesting, so I'll leave that there in case that actually works out. So, as I said, I think the business value or the value from features is fairly clear. Most people, when they talk about business value, that's mostly what they think about. But for me, one of the underlooked, and perhaps it's less underlooked now than it used to be, aspects of value in software comes from the design. And I think there are a number of ways that we can talk about this, but one of them, probably the most common that I use, one of the most common questions that I end up being asked is, well, my manager gets angry when I refactor. What should I do? And of course, obviously this starts out as some kind of technical problem, and then we realize within about 5 minutes of conversation that really we're dealing with a people problem. Jerry Weinberg was right. No matter what you think the cause of the problem is, it's almost always people. And so I've learned a magic phrase that actually helps in exactly this situation. Now, I want to teach this magic phrase to you. It's one of the many magic phrases that I use. It's one of my personal favorites because if you can learn to say it quickly and fluidly, then it sounds incredibly impressive. So you might find yourself in a situation where you're arguing, maybe not so heated yet, with a manager, with a senior technical person, with the person who is supposed to be your technical lead, with somebody who has perhaps the name architect or the word architect in their title, but at any rate, somebody who is very interested in how you're spending your time as a programmer. It might be a customer, or it might be someone pretending to be a customer. And they start giving you a little bit of heat. They start wondering why it is that you're spending all this time refactoring. And they feel like they're in conflict with you. You know, don't spend time refactoring. I need features. Stop spending all this time refactoring. I need features. And you just say to them, well, I don't really understand the problem. All I'm trying to do is reduce volatility and the marginal cost of features. Don't you want that? I feel like not enough of you got the power of that. I'm just reducing volatility and the marginal cost of features. What's the problem? Okay, so what does that phrase actually mean? Reduce volatility in the marginal cost of features. Well, good news, right? Already right away, the word features, right? We agreed that the word features tends to encourage people to think about this thing that they call business value, right? So if you use the word features in there, that suggests that you're interested in business value. I'm interested in business value. You're interested in business value. Everyone here is interested in business value. Wonderful. What about the rest of this? Now, I chose these words specifically because they sound vaguely smart, and because they happen to come from fields that are not software. And one of the most powerful things that you can do as a programmer in this situation is to use words that are not geek words. If you use geek words, you lose them. But if you can use words from fields like chaos theory or economics, is there a difference? Then that makes it a lot easier to connect with people in a way that they will understand and that they will appreciate and that they will believe. So, volatility is just the word uncertainty with slightly more syllables. Not a big deal. Marginal cost, if you don't know about economics or finance, then you might not have heard this term before. Marginal cost just means the cost of the next one. So if you are interested in your taxes, which I'm guessing everyone in this room is, then you're probably interested in knowing your marginal tax rate, which really just means the tax that you have to pay on the next currency unit of income. It doesn't really matter how much income tax you paid on all the money that you have already earned. You want to know how much money will I pay on the next 10 currency units, the next 100, the next 1,000. That's the marginal tax rate. And so when we say that we're just trying to reduce volatility in the marginal cost of features, really all we're saying is that we're trying to make more certain the cost of the next feature. Don't you want that? It seems to me that any product owner, any customer, any manager, any project manager, any product manager, any account manager who actually enjoys their job and being good at it will want the same thing that you want when you say, all this refactoring is just so that we can reduce volatility in the marginal cost of features. I'm trying to give you options to improve your ability to plan. What's the problem? And the nice thing about this phrase, especially if you practice it and can say it easily, first, it's impressive. Second, it sort of causes the other person to go, huh? And stop for a moment and think about what's happening. And once they get past the fact that the words are a little unusual, especially coming from a programmer's mouth, then they realize that this conflict between delivering features and improving the design, which is really all refactoring means, at least it should, the conflict in their mind between shipping features and improving the design of the system is exactly that. entirely in their mind. Bob Martin always has been saying for literally decades now, right? To go well is to go fast, or to go fast you must go well. Well, first of all, I'm not a big fan of fast. I'll come back to that in a moment. That's in my inbox. But for me, what really matters here is impressing upon the non-programmer people in your work, in your environment, in your project community, as Josh Karyevsky likes to say, that there is no conflict between shipping features, generating value they already understand, value we already agree on, and improving the design. That in fact what we're doing when that conflict is entirely in their head. When you stop them and say, I just want to reduce volatility and the marginal cost of features, what's the problem? More than anything else, you're turning the discussion away from the business and the technical folks sitting on opposite sides of the table to sitting on the same side of the table. We both want the same thing. There's no conflict here. Another way that I like to say this is that when I take care of the design, I'm protecting our capacity to deliver features. And that tends to make people pay attention too. It's not quite as impressive as this, but it works well. And so when somebody asks me how that works, I feel like I owe them some kind of an explanation. So here's what I offer them as a possibility. And I was worried this was going to happen, but it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Ooh, squeaking is wonderful. So let's take a look at the cost of adding features over time. Now I'm going to draw some curves that are probably going to make refactoring look very good, but that's not the whole part of the discussion. So first things first, what does it look like when we do not take care of the design? When we don't take care of the design, the cost of adding features over time tends to look like this. And if you're thinking to yourself, wow, he's drawn an exponential curve, is it really that bad? The answer is yes. And here's how I know. I don't know what your experience has been like, but in my experience, when we have bad design in the system, that tends to compound. As we like to say, the bad stuff accumulates. And it's not just that it accumulates, it's that having a difficult design to work with makes everything you do with that design more difficult, which then actually encourages you to do the wrong thing, which adds more stuff that becomes difficult to deal with. And that adds to the cost of trying to work with the code at all. And it does end up having a compounding effect. So now we do a little bit more math, not particularly scary, right? This is the compounding. And what happens as n goes to infinity? This goes to e. And that's how I know that this is actually an exponential curve. If it's not an exponential curve, it's pretty damn close. And it's certainly close enough for our discussion. But this isn't the whole story. What I want to draw next is the curve that is the dirty little secret of evolutionary design. And by the way, when I talk about test-driven development, that's just an implementation detail. What I really mean is evolutionary design, where we guide the design over time. We are essentially the supreme being in the universe of this design, guiding its evolution. Unfortunately, when we do it, see, the nice thing about the red curve, the nice thing about this, let's just get it out the door, is that you get started really quick, right? The first 3 or 4 weeks of the project always feels great. Blank sheet. Nothing's getting in my way. Well, nothing's had a chance to compound yet. And when we try to do things well, by our definition of well, let's be clear about that, it tends to be more expensive to start. And don't be fooled. That's also an exponential curve. But the base is a hell of a lot smaller. And if the base is a hell of a lot smaller, then the good news is it takes a really long time for that exponential curve to really kick in. Now, here is So the first dirty little secret of evolutionary design is the notion that that blue curve, at the beginning, the cost looks a lot higher than it does if we use the red curve. If we just go in there and just get stuff out the door like we've always done, it looks like we're going faster. And you are going faster. And this is the thing that some, let's say, evolutionary design enthusiasts are a little unwilling to admit to unless you corner them at the pub after the conference. I'm not going to make you wait that long. Now, if you look at these two curves, of course, you'll recognize something. The first thing that you'll recognize is that there's a point where this is true. So let's make this a little bit easier. Let's call this F. In the grand tradition of mathematics, we'll call that F, and we'll call this G. And there's a point, and we don't know more about it than that, where this is true. Did nobody warn you there would be calculus here? Yep. Don't worry. This is, once again, this is just an arcane notation that says that when we hit that purple line, the cost of getting it out the door and the cost of doing it well, by our standard of well, becomes the same. And as we go past that part of the curve, evolutionary design is pure profit. That's our big claim. That's the reason why we could possibly fill an auditorium of people at a conference about software development and talk about things like test-driven development, about refactoring. It's the reason why why we're all here, is because somewhere deep in our heart, we believe that this is true. That there's a point, we know that at the beginning, doing it the bad old way feels faster until suddenly it isn't. Until suddenly you're in the status meeting on Friday afternoon and you're talking about a feature and you say, yeah, I understand it, no problem, 2 weeks. And then Monday morning, with lots of coffee, you go in, you open up the code base, and you go, 2 months. We know that if we take care of the design as we go, then past that point T0, evolutionary design is pure profit. The problem is, I don't know when T0 is going to be. You don't know when T0 is going to be. You don't know when T0 is going to be. Nobody knows when T0 is going to be. There are simply too many variables involved. We're back to the chaos theory. There's no way for us to know. And by the way, if somebody walks in the room and claims to know that they know where T0 is, fire them immediately. They are lying to you. I would at least rather be honest about our ignorance. So now we have the problem that your manager who's telling you, or whoever it is, who's telling you, stop wasting all this time refactoring, might be right. How could that be? Here's how it could be. I don't know when T0 is, you don't know when T0 is, nobody knows when T0 is. That means that if by chance this project is going to die before T0, then the red curve is the better strategy. Let me say that again. If the project dies before T0, the red curve is the better strategy. That's the correct reaction. This guy's got his head in his hands. And I'm sorry. Like, not just Canadian sorry, but really sorry. I'm sorry that that's true, but that's an unavoidable fact. That because we don't know where T0 is, we can't be sure that on this project, we're going to get to T0. And your manager might be right. Probably not, but maybe. Yeah, exactly. We'll come back to Lean Startup in a moment. So here's the thing. When somebody tells you stop refactoring, And we'll ignore for now the fact that maybe we ought not to have that discussion at all. But let's assume, let's be charitable. Let's assume that whoever we're having this discussion with, we're ready to have this discussion with them. We're not just saying, look, you're a customer, you don't know programming, I don't know where you even heard the word refactoring, go away. I'm not talking about that conversation. I'm talking about the conversation where maybe we're talking to someone who has significant technical experience and has done evolutionary design, like, I don't know, me, or a number of the people in this room. You can't just shoo me away. I don't go away that easily. When I or that person says to you, stop spending all that time refactoring, how do you respond? Well, here's another trick. You draw the two curves, and there's a very good chance that that person will understand what you mean by these two curves and will generally agree that they're true. Draw the limit, draw the integrals if you have to convince them that even if you're wrong by up to a constant. It's no problem. Calculus joke worked. How about that? And then say, you know, when you tell me to stop refactoring, you're gambling that the project is going to end before T0. In fact, worse, you might not even be doing that. You might be gambling that you are going to leave the project somewhere before T0. I can respect that strategy. However, if you are leaving there, then I just need 2 weeks advance warning because I am leaving here. Now, I'd like to come back to this for a moment. There's another metaphor we can use here. When we don't take care of the design. So you've heard this whole saying about, you know, can you go as... My good friends in Stockholm at the Agile Consulting Company have had for years as their slogan, are you moving as fast as you can? And I think part of the problem is not that we're moving as fast as we can. When we're on the red curve, we are in fact moving much, much more quickly than we can. We are already driving the car past where we can handle steering it. And worse, remember, because of the compounding, we're not just driving it, we are accelerating continually towards a big brick wall. The brick wall is what I like to call, so there's another point, I don't know where it is exactly, but there's another point that I like to call Project Heat Death. Project Heat Death is the day when all the senior technical staff come into the room and have that really, really uncomfortable argument where somebody says, I think we have to throw it away and start again. It's the day when the cost of continuing with the code base is now higher than the cost of starting over. And that's when everybody looks at the CTO, and the CTO gets very nervous. And they say, well, I've got good news. You've got early vacation coming. We're going to bring in the new CTO who stands up and says, hi, folks. I'm the new CTO. Don't worry. We're going to do it again. We're going to do it in Python, and we're not going to make the same mistakes this time. We're accelerating towards a brick wall. When we hit the brick wall, that's when we hit Project Heat Death. That's when we have to have that really uncomfortable conversation. And your manager is saying, I think I can jump out of the car 10 seconds before we hit the brick wall. And then you say, cool, I'm jumping out 3 seconds before you. And if that's the case, then I am willing to respect that strategy. One of the most common questions people ask me when I do TDD training is, when do you not do TDD? And one of the few times that I say with absolute certainty that there's no point in doing TDD, there's no point in doing evolutionary design, if you are certain that the project will be dead before T0. You're going to throw it away in 3 weeks? Who cares? You have absolutely no intent in continuing the project after then, don't worry about it. You're only going to use it 4 or 5 times, who cares? You don't need any of that stuff. Evolutionary design is not going to help you. It might help you feel better, or maybe you just do test-first programming instead, where you write tests to make sure that you can type your code into the computer correctly, but otherwise you don't care what happens with the design. But the problem is, like I said, you don't know when T0 is, I don't know when T0 is, and don't we have a tendency to turn the prototype into a product anyway? There's a very good chance that someone is going to have to maintain this code at some point after T0. And that is what leads me to believe that evolutionary design is a good strategy. What I'm trying to do is to reduce volatility and the marginal cost of features. What I'm trying to do is protect our capacity to deliver features over time. All right. I think that's good enough for the moment. So that, for me, is a fair bit about the second value of software that I tend to think about, which is the design. And as I said, this is kind of where I spend most of my time, in part because I wrote a book once, and it happened to be kind of about something related to testing, and that's what everybody keeps asking me for. I used to feel bad about that. I don't anymore. I'm happy to go in. I love to be there at the moment when somebody sees their design evolve in front of their eyes, and it moves in a direction that's actually going to be helpful, and they have that hopeful look like, wow, maybe it's going to be different this time. I love that. But there's more to talk about here than just that. So let's take a look at a third value of software, and that is feedback. And I'm now looking at my phone, which in spite of my instructions has decided to go to the lock screen, which unfortunately means that for the moment, I am not entirely sure how much time I have left. I think I can do arithmetic on the actual time of day, but I'm not entirely, thank you very much, but I'm not entirely sure when I started. So I hear a rumor that I have about 20 minutes left, but I just want to be sure. I think I have 23. We will see who's right. We'll come back to estimates, actually. We'll come back to that in a moment. All right. How shall I do this? Yeah, let's go here. So, some of you, in your deep, dark past, have probably seen a diagram that looks a little something like this. Yeah? Yeah. It's funny how people think, they see this shape and for some reason they have the picture in their head of a waterfall. I'm not sure why that is. Let's please remember that the only difference between waterfall and agile software development is the length of the iterations. Okay? Let's put that to bed forever. Now, if you've actually read this paper by Winston Royce, in, I believe, 1970. That's what I keep saying, so I hope that's accurate. How many people here have actually read this paper? Okay, not a surprise. How many people here have seen the first paragraph of this paper? Right, in which Royce says very clearly, these are my opinions about software development. Somebody thought it was a good idea to base decades of an entire industry on one human's opinion. I would use my catchphrase here, but it's actually the punchline of the next joke. Now, on page 2 of the paper, you see a diagram that looks rather like this. And then if you read the next sentence under that diagram, it says that this is risky and invites failure. And if you read a little farther on, it says that this works for only the most straightforward projects. Those are the projects where you know the technology, you know the people involved, You've worked with them for a long period of time. You know the domain, and you've worked in it a long period of time. You know exactly which part of the problem you're trying to solve. It's very clearly well defined, and it's not likely to change. Everyone who has ever worked on that project, right? Not many of us. I still haven't worked on that project yet, unless you count me doing some little stupid thing over the weekend for fun. But I've never been paid to work on that project. Okay. Now, I mention this. I don't like to call this the waterfall because I think it misinterprets what Royce meant. If you go to page 4, you see, well, the first thing he does is he puts some feedback loops between testing and coding and design. And then if you look on something like page 6 or page 8, he just has arrows going in every direction, which, if you organize those arrows well enough, becomes agile software development. Again, just now we're arguing. Now we're just arguing about the length of the iterations. Okay? It turns out that if you make the iterations short enough, behavior has to change. That's what makes agile software development different from what people tried to do before. Anyway, how do we justify the ideas in agile software development? It's actually a little more difficult than you might think. Now, it's a little bit easier now because we've had almost 20 full years since the beginning, the first rumblings of extreme programming. And that means that we've had a long time to get used to it. There's an entire generation of people now who have grown up in a universe in which extreme programming was there before they were. And so, just by sheer accident of birth, there are a bunch of people who don't see agile software development as a big deal or as anything strange. Unfortunately, they're rather in the minority. But the good news is that we can use another simple trick to help people understand, non-programmers even, why the ideas in agile software development tend to work, and how they work to help us deliver more value and squeeze more profit out of software projects. And we can start here. This is, for me, my favorite part, that we can start here and apply a very simple idea and get where we want to go. Now, the idea that I'd like to use is an idea that is very old and has absolutely nothing to do with software. It actually comes from queuing theory. And it says, very simply, that you can imagine that in the middle of a process, in the middle of some long process or some system, there are two activities. Let's arbitrarily call them A and B. And A and B have a very special relationship with each other. B is the point at which you get some feedback about how well you did A. Now, that's good news or bad news depending on the length of the feedback cycle. I'll come back to that. So, in the process of doing B, we realize that there's some amount of A that we need to do again, and perhaps better this time. Now, the problem is we don't necessarily know, or at least it's hard to predict, how much of A we will need to redo. And we never know how many times we have to go around this loop. Again, very hard to forecast. Chaos theory, etc., proof left to the reader. We can fix this problem, or at least improve it, by taking B and moving it in front of A, and then doing that in small cycles. So we can take this and replace it with this. Small cycles. And if we do this, then the throughput through that part of the system goes up. On average, for most people, most of the time, you don't need spherical horses in a vacuum. It tends to happen that way. That's good. Really? No reaction to spherical horses in a vacuum. Come on. Thank you. So if we do this, throughput through that part of the system goes up. How can we use this? I'm glad you asked. Have you ever worked on a project where as soon as you start testing the code, you start to find out that you made some mistakes? I know people want to call them bugs. That's a very cute way of deflecting responsibility. There are some things that maybe crept in that we couldn't have foreseen. I'm happy to call those defects if you want, but mostly they're mistakes. Let's be honest. So what happens is you end up having to fix the mistakes, but you're not sure how much of the code is broken. People have difficulty forecasting where the bugs are going to be. Yeah, I have time to tell the joke. So, and I promise this will be within the code of conduct. Just listen to the whole joke before you judge. An American company contracts some work to a Japanese company. It's an older joke. Go with it. And they ask for 1 million parts, and they negotiate a 1% defect rate. The Japanese company is very happy to oblige. Everything goes fine. Contract signing, everyone's happy. Drinking sake, wonderful. 3 months later, 2 boxes show up at the loading dock at the warehouse of the client. And they're very confused. There's a big box and a little box. And the little box is marked 10,000 defective units. We're not capable of that level of forecast. We don't know where the mistakes are. As Ron Jeffries once said, if I knew which mistakes I were going to make, I wouldn't write tests. So we don't know how much of the code is broken, and we don't know how many times we have to go around this merry-go-round. How do you know that the testing phase of a project is over? It's August 15th. Somebody just decides, I'm sick of putting coins into the machine, I'm stopping now. It's as good as it's ever going to be. Okay, well, we can apply this trick. And so actually, let me ask, what is the throughput through this part of the system? The throughput through this part of the system is working code. By working, I mean passes all the tests that we could think of to write. That's as close as we can get to a useful definition of it works, which is otherwise maybe the most dangerous sentence in the English language per character. Because nobody agrees on it and nobody agrees on works. We can improve the throughput through this part of the system by writing a little test and a little bit of code and doing this in small cycles. Look familiar? Right, that's called test-first programming. Test-first programming is where we say, look, all we're asking you to do is write the test first. If your design process, if your ISO 9001 certified design process involves going into a dark room, lighting candles, and biting the heads off live chickens, as long as you do what you say and say what you do, you can be certified. I'm not asking you to change any of that. For test-first programming, all I'm interested in is thou shalt not write a line of production code without a failing test. That's it. So this is now test-first programming, and if we do that in small cycles, then the amount of working code per unit time should go up. And it generally does. And then we take this part of the system and we replace it with test-first programming. Cool. I'm a programmer, so whenever a trick works once, the first thing I have to do is try it again. So if it worked once, we can do it again. Let's try. Some of you might already know where this is going. It's okay. Enjoy the ride. Design followed by test-first programming. Have you ever worked on a project where the architect or senior technical staff did a bite the head off chickens, diagram, build it? You code monkeys, go build my masterpiece. So then you start, and then you realize that these two parts don't quite fit together, and those two parts don't quite fit together, and this side expects to receive an exception, but this side returns null, and all kinds of crazy things. And there's all kinds of monads over here, but this is all written like in PL1. None of it goes together. And so the problem is that we don't know how much of the design we're going to have to redo. We don't know how many times we're going to have to go through this loop. Oh, and of course, every time we do change the design, we go back and update the design documents, right? Just me? Okay. See, if you generate the design documents from the code, there's nothing to do. Anyway, what's the throughput through this part of the system? The throughput part of the system now is working code that we feel confident changing. That's what it means to design things, by the way. Design is just a fancy word for organize. And why do we organize code? Because the two things that get in the way of changing code is I don't know which part I need to change, and I don't know if I did it correctly. Well, tests help with the second part, and design helps with the first part. Right? If we increase cohesion, then it makes it more likely that when I finally figure out which part of the code I need to change, this is the only part I need to change. Because all the stuff related to that is here, and the stuff that's not related to that is elsewhere. So that's why we design things. We design things so that it's easier to know where to change it and to know that we did it correctly, or at least well enough. Well, we can improve throughput through this part of the system by writing a little test, then writing a little code, then doing a little design, that's that refactoring step, and doing this in small cycles. And of course, everyone knows what we call this test-driven development. Test-driven development is really just writing correct code and keeping it easier to change over time. So now, we're a little closer. Not sure what just fell, but it was the magnet. Okay. No problem. All right, well, if it worked twice, it'll work a third time. See if you can visualize it. Requirements, followed by test-driven development. Have you ever worked on a project where you built a bunch of stuff, beautifully designed, you kept the cost of change low, and it all works, and you hand your masterpiece to the customer, and they say the magic words, "That's not what I meant." Now, when you work for 3 months and a customer says, "That's not what I meant," all you can do is cry. But if you work for 2 days and you get your customer to say, "That's not what I meant," you can be happy because you can do something about that. What's the throughput through that part of the system? Requirements followed by test-driven development. That's working code that we feel confident to change that will probably deliver value. That will probably result in profit. Probably, well, let's say potentially profitable. Well-designed working code. Well, if we write a test and do a little bit of code and do a little bit of refactoring and then do a little bit of analysis, which might mean talking to a customer. Is this what you meant? Yes, looks great, keep going. Here's another cycle through. Is this what you meant? Yes, keep going. Then the throughput through that part of the system goes up. And we call that behavior-driven development. Oh, this is getting good, I got to tell you. We're almost there. Behavior-driven development followed by maintenance, or as it would be called today, operations, because more syllables makes things better. George Carlin fans? Really? Nobody? So, have you ever worked on a project where you built the right thing, you built it well, and it works, and everyone's happy, you pop the cork in the champagne, and then you find out that it's not going to be deployed for 3 months? If you want to know what situation your company is in, try to deploy Hello World and see how long it takes. Also count how much paperwork you have to fill out for those. And just because it's not on paper anymore doesn't mean it's still not paperwork. All right, well, what's the throughput through this part of the system? The throughput through this part of the system is no longer potentially profitable, well-designed working code, but is in fact profitable, well-designed working code. Code that's in use in production and actually generating money. My favorite 5 words, the reason for agile software development overall, cash in my pocket sooner. is the difference between cash flow investing and long-term investing. Yeah, there's some humane stuff in there too. That's all extremely important, but that's not the purpose of this talk. Hold your cards and letters. Cash in my pocket sooner, and that's what I get. When I write a little test, write some code, do the design, and deploy it, then in fact I can start getting real feedback in the form, my favorite form of feedback in the professional software world, currency units. Right? Otherwise, this is just a hobby. Hobbies are fine, but I generally don't get paid for my hobbies. Now, so we can replace behavior-driven development followed by maintenance with small cycles, and we call that lean startup. I got that wrong. Wicked. Let's try that again. We're going to edit this part out. So when it comes time to behavior-driven development followed by maintenance, if we do that in small cycles, then we get continuous delivery, which is what I meant to say on the first take. I know I just ruined the editing, but it's funnier that way. But there's one step we didn't talk about, which is investment. That's at the beginning of all this. And now I've ruined the final punchline, but that's okay. So, small cycles, and that becomes lean startup. My point is that we can start with something that most of the world has begrudgingly agreed after nearly 50 years doesn't work. The single pass waterfall, the thing that Royce told us would never work anyway. And all we do is apply one trick from queuing theory, a trick that they used at Toyota 100 years ago when they were working on looms. And we can use that today to help justify why we are so interested in things like pair programming, why we are so interested in test-driven development, and all these other weird techniques, which all have one important thing in common: faster feedback. So here's one last thing that you can use to help with your projects, especially if you are the person in your organization trying very hard to promote more iterative and incremental approaches to software development, and people just aren't listening. It's not you, it's not them, it's the system. And the thing that's getting in the way are long feedback cycles. Almost every problem boils down to some combination of two people don't like to talk to each other and long feedback cycles. By the way, those two are the same thing, right? So what do you do when you have a long feedback cycle? You pick some part of your system that interests you, you identify a long feedback cycle, what do? You don't do what a whole bunch of us ran out to do 20 years ago, which is to say, if you just switch to 1-week iterations, everything will be fine. Because if you go from 12 months to 1 week, you die. If you want, you might as well just take all the cash in the company's accounts, go out into a forest, put it all on the forest floor, pour gasoline over it, light a match, and walk away. But what do you do with a long feedback cycle? Here's a trick that seems to work. Cut it in half. Just half. Now that might not seem like much, but trust me, cutting a feedback cycle in half is hard enough that it actually forces you to change the way you work. But it's one of those just enough challenges. It's one of those things that is challenging, but not so challenging that you give up. It's challenging in a way that makes you energized to try to do it. And so if you cut the feedback cycle in half, give the organization a chance to reorganize itself, to get adjusted to the new way of working, then at some point, that feedback cycle at half the length starts to feel long. Okay, now that we've all got used to how to work this way, let's take that feedback loop and cut it in half again. And that will force us to change the way we work, and we'll have to do some things differently, and then gradually we'll get used to it, and then at some point we'll come back around to this being the bottleneck, and let's cut it in half again. And that seems to work. Now, for you, the Agile evangelist in your organization, that might seem very slow. But if you walked up to an executive and said, I can probably get everyone in this organization, well, business unit, whatever makes sense for the conversation, to move down to producing realizable value every 2 weeks, apparently I'm done. And if I could tell you that we could have that in 5 years, that within 5 years we could go from these horribly long feedback cycles to realizing value every week, every 2 weeks, cash in your pocket every week, every 2 weeks, that executive couldn't reach for their credit card fast enough. At that point, they will hire you and not ask you how much it'll cost. That's a free tip from the book $1 Million Consulting. No, really, Alan Weiss, great book. If you make the value of your work so well articulated and clear and compelling enough, then they will hire you before they know how much you cost. All right, so features, design, feedback, 3 values of software, a handful of little tricks that will help you communicate the value of what you're doing to people who either are or aren't programmers, speaking in the languages of pure mathematics and economics. I think that might help a lot of these conversations go a bit more smoothly. If they don't, just go to tell.jbrains.ca and tell me that I'm completely wrong. Tell me about the conversation, and maybe I can help you out. As long as you're willing to wait indefinitely for an answer, that service is free. If you need a better service level agreement, let me know and we'll talk about how much that costs. I promise it's not as much as you think. Paldies.
Well, thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. Actually, we have only one question in Slack. Maybe I'll ask it right away.
Absolutely, I'm happy to answer.
So, well, everybody talks a lot about TDD,
yes.
But why in real life nobody does that? That's a question from the audience, not from me.
Assumes facts, not in evidence. So I think probably, you know what, I didn't get to talk about this. If you'll indulge me for 1 minute. You've probably heard about the learning curve before, but I'm going to bet that a bunch of you have never seen it. So I'll give you the really short version, I promise. Here's the learning curve. Time, productivity. I don't care how you measure productivity. Use whatever measure is in your mind. This is how it looks. Some people know this as the Satir change model. So the idea is that you learn something or you do stuff for a while and your productivity increases, then you learn something and you slow down while you're trying to figure out how to integrate your new learning with what you did before. And assuming that you learned something helpful, then your productivity goes up back to where it was and beyond. But then you need to learn something else, and it looks like this. And here's the problem. The problem is there. Again, I don't have to write the integral this time. You get me, right? Nobody knows how long the payback period is. Again, the dirty little secret of our work is that we have no idea how long it will take for this profit to pay back the learning that you invested. And that's probably why nobody does it. Because nobody seems to be willing to pay the price. Nobody seems to be willing to invest in the learning. And so unfortunately what ends up happening is those of us who have managed to get paid to do test-driven development probably had to make that investment in their own learning themselves. That initial investment fell to us. Now that doesn't mean it has to be the same for you. But if you're asking the question why, I think this is the answer. Is that in this period right here, where we're waiting for the payback period, everybody panics. And because they panic, nobody wants to be the one to invest. And that's why I think not enough people do test-driven development. They recognize the value, and nobody wants to be the one to pay the bills. So unfortunately, sometimes it's left to us. The good news is, if you do practice test-driven development, it's pure profit for you. You can reinvest that profit any way you like. Maybe with the next employer. I'm just saying. All right.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I don't want to interfere with the coffee break. Go.